It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's second annual Justice Lecture, jointly hosted by Lawyers in Libya and the SOAS Center for Human Rights Law. The lecture, Doing Justice, International Investigations and the Path to Accountability, addresses an important and still perhaps somewhat overlooked development in international human rights law.
Although we're not physically at SOAS this year, for reasons we all know, this lecture is very much still part of the partnership between Lawyers for Justice in Libya and the Center for Human Rights Law at SOAS, and will be conducted in the SOAS spirit, collegiate, challenging, and lively. To lead us through this conversation, we could not have a better captain. I am thrilled that this year's lecture will be given by the wonderful Hanny Megally. Hanny is a commissioner with the Commission of Inquiry for Syria and a senior fellow at the NYU Center for International Cooperation. Before that, he was director of the Asia Pacific, Middle East and North Africa Division at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And before that still wore several hats at the International Center for Transitional Justice, including as acting president. And now, for the person you really want to hear from, let's listen to Hanny Megally's lecture.
Today I will briefly introduce international human rights investigations by the United Nations, touching on the main characteristics and functions of such bodies. I will then look at the evolving role of commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions in the global effort to hold perpetrators accountable and to obtain broader justice for victims and survivors. Last, I will reflect on some good practices and areas for potential improvement that new mandates such as the Libya fact-finding mission may want to reflect upon. This brings us to the heart of today's discussion. How do commissions and FFMs help in assisting accountability or achieving justice? So there's an important role that these mechanisms can play in assisting broader justice issues, such as locating the missing, return of refugees and IDPs, HLP rights, reparations, etc. For the COI on Syria, efforts on this front have focused on advocacy, the publication of policy documents, and participation in discussions and events. But is that enough? In some ways, commissions and FFMs are becoming one of the few consistently available tools for the international community to react to complicated, ongoing crises and conflicts for which further action has been blocked in other fora. The continuous extensions of mandates for human rights fact-finding missions covering Yemen, South Sudan, Syria, Burundi, and now perhaps Libya and Venezuela reflects the gridlock in other areas. I thank you for being here with me virtually today and very much look forward to the discussion going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanny, and for joining us from New York. How has it been for you so far?
Oh, very good, very good. Excellent.
I wanted to reflect on something that is an issue, that we think about a lot at LFJL, which is about how we bring in victims' voices more, or do we bring in victims' voices more, and what are the, if you like, the costs that might entail, or what are the benefits that could bring as well?
I mean, I guess it's more a question of the mechanisms are intended to investigate grave violations and to report on them, but we ought to also be seeking to bring them to an end, and that ought to be part of the mandate, even though actually when you look at the mandates, they don't take that extra step. But then we want to be saying what are the priorities that the victims and the survivors, the justice-based priorities that they want us to hear, and how can we deal with them? And again, if I look at the work on Syria, you will see that, one of the big priorities is the question of the missing and the disappeared in Syria. And here it's not a question of bringing perpetrators to justice. That's an important aspect. But it's also the families wanting to know what's happened to our relatives. And again, if you listen to the victims and the survivors, you will hear the day-to-day problems that they're facing. And it will switch you to other areas of rights violations.
anyone with your record, Hanny, would understand that you are really the linchpin of human rights struggles in the region, and therefore...
And I was very worried speaking after you spoke last.
You are very kind, Hanny. I am as concerned as you are about the fact that we keep creating instruments, but we are not always mindful of the relationship between what we expect from them and the resources and the attributions that we give to them. And I would love you to comment on this topic.
Where the mechanisms really have a much broader, I think, mandate, and as you said, Pablo, are there to serve the victims and the survivors. And there are risks in pushing too much in one direction only. Now we're working within a context that continues to evolve. And as we're seeing the mandates being extended repeatedly, the Commission of Inquiry now in its ninth year. And that again, impacts what the structures look like. And I've said a few things in the paper about maybe there's a need to rethink the structures and to ensure that they can cope with that situation.
I'm a criminal prosecutor, and I was one of the people in that pink slice of the pie, as you might imagine. But recognize very much, of course, we've got the mechanism for Myanmar and we have the one for Syria, but now we're getting commissions and fact-finding missions being given very specific criminal justice mandates, as in South Sudan and in Libya, and to some extent also in Yemen, really without the resources.
It's a very important question because it brings us back to what's the situation of ordinary people during a conflict, for example, like the Syria conflict, or you'll see with the Libya conflict.
Thank you very much, Hanny, for this really interesting and very informative lecture. I really learned a lot from that. And you have actually prompted me to pose a question I have been thinking about for quite a while. You mentioned land, housing, hospitals, bombing hospitals, and so on. I was wondering for a long time how much issues around economic and social rights and cultural rights are being accommodated or worked on in commissions of inquiries in general. And I'm asking from not only the Syria experience, but your wide experience, if you could. Is it like in terms of mandate, but also in terms of the practice, is it a weaker area of work, or is it something that is there, and what can be done in that area?
Yeah, it's definitely within the mandates, and I agree with you. It tends to be the weaker area to do work on. When you're faced with bombings and deaths in custody, etc., then of course that tends to take priority, and the work on accountability takes priority. It gets, of course, more difficult when you have absolutely no access to the country in question, as with the Syrian investigation. But it just means you have to give dedicated resources and try to focus on those areas. We could probably be doing more on the sort of socio-economic side of things, but it's definitely central to the mandate and should not be, given second place. Of this new mechanism now for Libya, it's a good opportunity to put our heads together and see how they can put their best foot forward.